Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hi there, this is James Valvis coming at you with a new Freeform. Freeform is the kind of talk I do where I just start spouting about stuff. And today I wanted to talk about the difference between a classical liberal and a conservative and why they're both better than progressives, even though one is better than the other. And I believe that the classical liberal is by far the preferable thing to be, not just now, but for all eternity. It's not, it's for mankind, it's the best thing to be. For God, conservative probably, a God can be progressive and conservative at the same time, and also a classical liberal at the same time. But a man must choose to be one or the other or the other. And between those, the best is the classical liberal. But let me first explain what a conservative is, what a progressive is, and what a classical liberal is. You have to put classical in front of liberal, because if you say liberal now, progressives in the early 20th century were so horrendous in the things that they believed that they could no longer go by the term progressive, because it was so disgraced. It was so dishonorable to be a progressive. Progressives were directly responsible for the dual tragedies of fascism and communism. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But they're distinctly, and also eugenics. That was probably the main thing. But eugenics has, reached its culmination in the Holocaust. And so, when I say that they're responsible for fascism, even though they come from different kinds of psychologies, fascism and communism, they're essentially the same kind of political philosophy. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But so you have to put classical in front of liberal so you can differentiate, because the word liberal has been poisoned. I really feel that we should steal the word liberal back to what it means and what it's supposed to mean. It's a good thing to be liberal. It's not a bad thing to be liberal. It's a better thing to be liberal than it is to be a conservative. And it is a far better thing to be a liberal than to be a progressive. And, the problem is, again, they've polluted the language, just like they polluted the language of gay. You can no longer use gay to mean happy. You can no longer use queer to mean odd. They steal these words, these perfectly natural, normal words, and now you can no longer use them. Even the word nigger, which was an insult and a slur, has been polluted to mean something else now, which basically means, my black brother to blacks, and to whites it means, you're the most inveterate racist possible. And let me tell you something. When I use the word nigger in an academic sense, as I'm using now, I don't say N-word. It's ridiculous. We're adults here. We know that I'm not using that word as a slur against black people. I don't feel that black people are inferior to white people in any biological sense. So it's ridiculous. But we're not gonna pussyfoot around it. We're not gonna be children here and protect each other's feelings by not saying words. I would never use that word as a slur. I would never use most words as a slur. And so not just that, but you could bitch, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, any of that stuff that's that's vulgar. But I'm not going to tiptoe around these words either, as if I'm we're children here. If you're a child, you probably shouldn't be listening to me, but you probably have heard if you're online, you've heard much worse than this. So maybe you should be listening to me so you can get an understanding of your world rather than the garbage that you're fed every day. And so we're going to play off a quote by G.K. Chesterton. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but it basically goes something like this. Now, G.K. Chesterton was a liberal. And people don't think of G.K. Chesterton as a liberal because he was an Orthodox Christian, especially an Orthodox Catholic. Later in his life, he converted to Catholicism, and he was Orthodox, and he was the greatest defender of Christianity in modern times. C.S. Lewis is right behind him, but the greatest defender of Christianity in modern times by far is G.K. Chesterton. He was a genius of monumental proportions. There was nobody could touch him. They threw every atheist at him, George Bernard Shaw, every atheist that you can possibly think, that thought that they were so smart, came up against Chesterton and lost. He would absolutely destroy them. And these were very intelligent, witty people. One of my favorite lines from a Chesterton debate, actually, it's a point to Shaw, but it shows you how clever these people can be when they wanted to be. And G.K. Chesterton was a very large, heavy-set man, and George Bernard Shaw was a very gaunt, thin, lanky man, very slender and very shrunken cheeks and everything. And G.K. Chesterton said, "To look at you, George, would to think that there was a famine in England." And George Bernard Shaw, who was very clever, said, "And to look at you, Mr. Chesterton, it would seem as if you were the cause of it." That's a really funny exchange. These people were friends. George Bernard Shaw and G.K. Chesterton were dear friends. They exchanged letters. They were very close. But George Bernard Shaw was an unrepentant atheist. He just had no use for religion at all. He was like a modern Richard Dawkins or something like that, only at the literary mold. And one of the greatest writers of of all time, really. I mean, some of his plays are some of the greatest plays ever written. It doesn't change the fact that he was morally decrepit in his philosophy, but you just absolutely you have many progressives like that who were wonderful writers and seminal writers like H.G. Wells and people of that sort who were absolutely horrible in their implications. I mean, if you look at, like, say, something like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, I mean, basically that's a racist treatise. Who do you think the Morlocks are? They're a bunch of Mongoloid or African. They're symbolic Africans. These cave dwelling, these underground people are just symbolic for the uncultured, unenlightened, non-English white people, European white people. That's really all they were. And Eloi were that. They were the enlightened. That's why you have these ape-like people under the ground eating human flesh. That's all based on African people. And then he somewhat denies this later on, but it's absolutely a fact. I mean, it's just obvious. It's obvious that's what it is. And The Time Machine is one of the great novels of all time, but it doesn't change the fact that its author viewed this racism all through it. If you don't read it that way, you can just see it as a great little tale of a cautionary tale of war and that kind of thing. But for the most part, yeah, there's stuff going on there because these people were eugenicists. They really they looked at the different. No, I'll get into that when I talk about the progressives. So what I want to do is I want to distinguish. So we want to play off this quote by G.K. Chesterton. So let's get the quote. The quote is conservatives want to keep making all the old mistakes, and progressives want to make all new ones. And so G.K. Chesterton was saying something very proud. He leaves out there that classical liberals are the right way of doing things, and he actually believed distributivism, which is an economic philosophy that is a little bit like Trumpism. It's the guy in the middle is doing the good work in the world, and you don't want you want to top things out there and put a lot of emphasis on that middle class. That's what distributism is. It's not. So to some degree, America is as close to distributism as possible. As possible in the economic and political climate. So what he's saying there is that both these kinds of thinking are wrong. Both the progressive and the conservative are both mistakes because they don't allow for useful change in the sense of the conservative. The conservative fights too hard for the status quo, whether the status quo is good or not. And we'll get into that more later. But the progressive they fight for stupid change. They fight for change that they don't. Another great Chesterton quote is never tear down a wall or a fence until you know why it was put up. And progressives do this all the time. You think about transgendered people in the military. Now, I served in the military, and let me tell you something. You don't want transgender people in the military. You just don't want them there. The military is not for practicing rights. The military is for protecting rights. Transgender people make up like maybe 0.1% of the population. If you put them in the military, it's going to cause confusion. It's going to cause anger. It's going to cause all kinds of problems with unit and mission cohesion. It's just not the place where you want men dressing up as women. It just isn't a good idea. It's a bad place to practice that particular freedom. You want that freedom? Fine. Go over there and practice it, but don't bring it into the military. So it's stupid change. It's not a good change. It's not a change that will help people protect human liberty. It will instead hinder that mission. You think that you're advancing human liberty by letting these people into the military, when in fact you're hurting it. See, that's why progressives are, they make, what's what he says, they make all new mistakes. They want to tear down a wall that is there for a reason, and they don't care about what the reason is, or they don't think about it at all. And so that's what G.K. Chesterton is saying there. So I don't consider myself either. I've been saying this for a long time. I neither consider myself a progressive. I certainly don't consider myself that. Nor do I consider, you look at the history of progressivism, it's awful. Conservatism is a whole lot better, but it's at least better. And I don't consider myself a conservative. I see conservatives as sticking to many mistakes, and as we'll talk about later, they don't just stick to it; they grow with it. We'll talk about that later. Okay. Now, what is at the heart of progressivism in relation to conservatism? Now, this is where conservatism is right. Okay, the heart of the conservative idea is that mankind is fundamentally flawed. He's fundamentally flawed, and the beast within man, the sin within man, the original sin that the Christians originally talked about, is within every man, and you cannot get that original sin out of him. He will always forever be flawed. He will always forever turn to greed, or turn to lust, or turn to hate and wrath. He'll always turn to these problems because he's fundamentally flawed. There's something about humanity that is fallen, that it will never, ever achieve perfection. And the progressive says, well, that's awfully bleak. I believe we can achieve perfection because I'm an optimist and I love humanity, and all we have to do is get rid of the darkies and we'll all be good. And that's the way they started. Now, of course, they progressed from that because it's, you had a Holocaust and you had all kinds of other genocides in the 20th century. And so they don't talk like that. But basically, that's the whole idea behind it, is that we can progress into a perfect society. We can progress into, if we perfect society, we will perfect man. That is their idea. That is why they are always trying to get, the rich to pay a little bit more, or whatever they say. It's always to perfect society, because if you perfect society, then the black people won't kill each other anymore, or the Hispanics will not run across the border anymore, or whatever it is, whatever social issue they think, or we throw more money toward that, then we won't have problems. And the conservative says, no, we'll still have those problems. We'll still have those problems, but we'll what we need to do is cut off the eye that cut out the eye that offends thee. So both of these are problematic. Now, the thing about progressivism that is so problematic is that they have a view of life that is utopian in nature. And every utopia turns to a dystopia. This is axiomatic. There is no such thing as a utopia in this life. There is a utopia in the next life. Now remember, the left has given up on God. That is part of their progress. They see progress as a God-free world, because God holds people back, makes them conservative. So they get rid of the afterlife. The afterlife is gone. So that utopia of heaven is no longer a possibility. Therefore, you can't get justice in that life, in the next life. You can't get happiness in the next life. So you have to get justice and happiness in this life by all means necessary. By all means necessary. It's important, because what happens is that by all means necessary ends up with a lot of dead bodies piling up in mass graves. Okay? This is what happens. So you have, and the utopia takes many forms. Now, one of the communist forms, it's an economic utopia, where they want to have, everybody has everything that they need, but nothing more. You have enough, to each according to the needs, from each according to their abilities. Now, this is a complete affront on freedom. A classical liberal hates this idea, but they think it's great because everybody will be equal. And who wants to be equal? Well, the people who always want to be equal are the people who are at the bottom of whatever it is. If you're ugly, you want to be, you want to have equality of beauty. If you're rich, if you're poor, you want to have equality of wealth. If you can't play guitar, you want to have equality of musical skill, whatever it is. Of course, this is a pipe dream. You can't have really equality in life. There's no such thing as equality. Equality exists only in mathematics. It doesn't exist in life. I have my wife, you have your wife, or I switch it and make it husband, or whatever it is, and there is no equality there. My wife is simply better than your wife. Trust me on this, she really is. So there isn't any possible way for us to be equal in life. There isn't. So we are endlessly unequal, and to fight for this kind of equality in all things, even equality in economic things, is impossible, because somebody is always going to have more of something. So somebody, the light shines more on one yard than the other, and that person gets more tomatoes than the person in the next house over, because they're more in shade. Now there's equality. Is it fair? I don't know. Maybe the guy with the bad light worked harder. Maybe it's not fair, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because there's always going to be an equality. And if you fight for that, fight for equality there, if you go in and you start kicking out somebody's tomato plants because they get more tomatoes than you, well, that's an injustice. So you can't really have this equality of outcomes without bringing about great injustice. You can't go steal his tomatoes and have that be justice. Nothing makes it equal. There's always, you have to have injustice to create justice. That doesn't make any sense, right? So all utopias come to a bad end. They all become dystopias, every last one of them. Now, every movement in the 20th century that ended in disaster, just about all of them, were all attempts at utopia, starting with the French Revolution and working its way through fascism and communism. You say, whoa, Jim, fascism's on the right. They're conservatives. No, they're not. They were progressives. Now, hear me out. There is a different kind of progressive, but they're still progressive, because they were trying to perfect society, but they were not trying to perfect society through economic equality. They weren't that. That was the communists. They were trying to perfect, that was their experiment, the communists. Instead, they were trying to make a utopia of race. They were trying to get rid of the Jew and get rid of the black and get rid of the inferior mongrel races that were causing. So they still had a utopian view of the world. But in that utopia, the master race controlled everything, at least controlled it. They didn't eliminate the lower races in the final solution. They had at least had control. The proper order of the world was in place, in which the master race controlled everything. That's a utopian vision. That is not a vision based on liberal principles, which is that all men, you look at the Constitution and you look at the Bill of Rights and you look at the Declaration of Independence. These are all liberal documents. When you look at, they come out of the Enlightenment. When was Fascism comes out of the progressive understanding, comes out of the Nietzschean understanding, the utopia through race perfection. The utopia, communism is the perfection through economic equality. And you have some other weird little, take a James Jones thing. That's perfection through religious purity, through the cult, through the commune. You go out there and you live simply, and that is a utopian view, and it always comes to a bad end, always. That's why all these cults out there, they always come to a bad end because they're not liberal in any real sense. So that's the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, at its very heart, is the perfection of mankind through utopian vision society. Okay. Now this comes from Rousseau. Rousseau said that mankind is innocent and perfect, and everywhere he's in chains. In other words, it's because society is ruining mankind. He himself is perfect, and we see this all over the place. If you take the "love is love" quote that's going around all over the place, love is love. Love is not love. There are different kinds of loves, and some of those loves are ordered properly, and some of them are not. I don't want to get into a rant on gay marriage here or something. That's not what I'm talking about here. But I want to say that love, if you have the love of a 2-year-old infant, your love is not love. It is sickness. It is disease. It is not even love. It's perversity. If you love a tree in a sexual way, there's something freaking wrong with you. Okay, love is not love. Because they say this, it's not true. It doesn't mean it's true. And so that's the progressive side of things. Now let's talk about a little bit what's wrong with conservatism. Now conservatism can be good or bad. Conservatism, you need, first of all, you need a little bit of progressivism and a little bit of conservatism. But the conservatism really depends on the society of whether it's a good conservatism or a bad conservatism. Now, if you're a conservative in Soviet Russia, right, in 1975, you're a bad guy. You're a bad guy if you're conservative in Soviet Russia in 1975, because what you love is Stalin, and you love the Politburo, and you love the KGB, and you love shooting people in the back of the head because they criticize the communist government. And you're a bad guy if you're conservative. But if you're an American conservative in 1975, you're a good guy, because you're trying to uphold the status quo of the liberal principles that have guided this country for 200 something years. I guess exactly 200 years. I'm 199. So conservatism's worth is based on what it's trying to conserve. What it's trying to conserve. What status quo is it trying to preserve? Is its worth? Now, conservatism has the fundamental idea right, and that it seeks order because the center will not hold. That's the famous quote. The center will not hold. And the conservative understands this, unlike the progressive. The progressive thinks that they can just tear at the edges of the center forever and it will stay intact. That's not the case. It's like putting transgender people in the military. It's a bad idea because the military is part of the center. And if you tear at that center enough, the whole thing flies apart. It explodes and it implodes. You don't want to tear at the center. You want to leave the center alone. The heart of the American experiment. You don't want to mess with that. You can play around the edges of it, but the center itself has to be left alone. You have to hold the center. You have to hold that tightly connected and keep it in an orderly and not chaotic manner. Because if you do let that become chaotic, then the whole thing falls apart. This is obvious in anything, in a life, in a household, in a country. If the center of anything is in bad shape, it rots from the inside. You can, if you have an apple and you start to get little brown spots on it, you can cut away the brown spots if you need to, right? Because you want to eat the apple. But if that thing is rotten at its core, you can't eat the thing. It's just bad. It's a bad apple. And so conservatism, often it depends on what they're trying to conserve, whether or not it's a good thing. Okay? They at least understand that sometimes that wall that's up there, that needs to be up. You need to keep that wall up there because there's a reason for that wall. Now, they may not know what the reason is. And sometimes they want to keep up walls that don't need to be up, or that are hurting people in the long run. And so sometimes they're in error. But at least they have some understanding that the center needs to hold for society to go on. And of course, because they want society to go on, whereas progressives don't, conservatives are generally happier people. We know this psychologically. And the reason that they want things to stay the same is because they're generally happy with what is. Whereas progressives are miserable people often. They pretend to be happy or this or that, but they're not really happy, because if you're happy, you don't want things to change too much. Now, I know a lot of conservative gay people, right? And they want one thing to change. Okay, they want homosexual marriage. But otherwise, they're generally happy people. They don't want to bring down the whole country. They're generally happy people. They want to preserve the center, but they want to change what they think is with this outside thing. I happen to think that's a lot closer to the center than they think, but it doesn't matter, because these people are not generally a danger to the country. But the people who are really ripping at the center, they're a problem. What happens with conservatives, though, here's what happens. Here's a problem with conservatives, and one of the reasons I'm not a conservative, is conservatives will try to maintain the status quo no matter what happens to the status quo. So what do I mean by this? Okay, conservatives in the 1950s would be far more likely to be racist, right? So they would support racism, which is a bad thing, by the way. And then, but then the 60s happened, and there will be civil rights, and the new status quo will be established, where black people get to go to whatever bathroom they want, and drink from whatever water fountain they want, and sit in any part of the bus that they want, and that becomes the new norm, the new normal. And then conservatives actually end up wanting to preserve that. Okay, we see this in modern parlance, don't we? Conservatives all the time talk about maintaining the civil rights thing, whereas progressives try to undo it. Here's the funny thing. They try to undo it because they're unhappy people. Remember, they're trying to have all black dormitories and separate blacks and whites can't attend this event or that event. This change from conserving what is bad to something that's good is something that's good about conservatism. If you can make the argument and progress toward a better world, the conservative will then defend the better world because they like the status quo. But here's the problem with that. If you change the world to a worse place, they'll defend that status quo too. Now that's important to know. Here's the problem here, and here's how they work together. The progressive changes something to be better. All right. For instance, civil rights. Black people, should be able to drink from any water fountain they want. Okay, that's a good change. Okay, the conservative he'll fight that while it's going on, but eventually, that idea will take hold and it will be the status quo, and the conservative will defend that idea. It will defend that a black person. It will become part of the status quo, and the conservative will take that in and want to maintain it. But what happens when the progressive decides we need to kill all the white people, and that becomes the status quo? You can see now all of a sudden the conservative will fight against that for a while, but once it becomes universally accepted, the conservative will take on that status quo and he will own it and he will love it. This is the problem with conservatism. The progressives can change things to good or bad. They often don't care which way because they're unhappy people. But the conservative, who's generally a happy person, will say, I like the status quo. I'm a happy guy. So I'll just fight for whatever the status quo is at the moment. That's a problem. That is how we end up having this endless shift to the left. You see, the progressive fights and fights and fights. They fight until they get no-fault divorce, and then they get no-fault divorce, and that becomes the status quo. They fight until they get, contraception, and then they fight until they get, abortion on demand. Now, some conservatives can be so morally horrified by these things that they fight against it. But generally speaking, they don't fight hard. There's abortion clinics right around the corner from most of us, and they go unmolested. Maybe somebody standing outside praying. Because conservatives generally just let the status quo go, and they generally just let bad things remain. That's why Obamacare is still on the books, because once the left knows this too about it, but they're not dumb. They know that once they change something, it's stuck. Like Kavanaugh right now is trying to be confirmed, and the first thing she's, Senator from California, the one Kamala Harris, asked her, do you feel it's settled law about gay marriage? And he refused to answer. And they're like, oh my God, he won't say this is settled law. And the reason they want that to be settled law is because they're progressives. But a conservative generally, listen, when Trump ran for president, he said, I really support gay marriage. And people in the Republican convention hall cheered him. That's just it wasn't even 10 years ago that they were fighting tooth and nail to stop this. But that's a conservative for you. That is what they do. They are, in their essence, people who like the status quo, no matter what that status quo is. It can go all the way up to genocide and the most horrible things possible. They don't start it that way. The progressive turns a country into a genocidal maniac government. That's what they do. But the conservative, once they become the genocidal maniac country, even progressive can turn conservative because they like it. They find their happy place, their happy spot. Oh, we're killing enough, black people now, so now I'm happy. So now I can, I'm a racist. I'm a progressive. I wanted to, to kill all the black people, and so now I've hit the sweet spot, and I'm a conservative. I want to protect this thing, and that's what you see with gay marriage, right? They hit their sweet spot. They don't want, they don't need to progress any further than that, and so they'll fight tooth and nail to conserve that law and not see them progress toward a different law or a change in a law. So that's how the progressive becomes the conservative. And somehow how the conservative, if he really is a moral person, can become a progressive. Because he could say, I'm not happy with the status quo anymore. You've gone too far. The classical liberal, which is what I am, throws them both away. And he says, is this good change or is this good status quo? That's what he asks himself. And he wants in every way to protect himself from the people, from the progressives who want to change society very quickly before anybody realizes how bad their changes are, and the conservative who doesn't want to change society at all, no matter how bad society is. And that's why the founders were profound classical liberals. They understood this on both sides were a mistake. They understood it. And if you understand it, there is no possible way that you can be an intelligent person and be either a progressive or a conservative. Now, it's better to be a conservative, generally speaking, in America at this moment. At this moment, it's better. Now, it wasn't better to be a conservative in Nazi Germany in 1944. That's a bad guy. Okay? It's not better to be a conservative in Castro's regime, or it's not better to be a conservative over there in North Korea. It's not better to be conservative in China. But in the United States, when you're trying to conserve the founding principles of this country, it's better to be a conservative than a progressive who wants to tear at the center and rip this country apart and end the great classical liberal experiment that our founders put in place. Remember, Ben Franklin said to us that when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, a woman asked him, "Sir, what kind of government did you give us?" And Benjamin Franklin said, "Madam, we gave you a republic if you can keep it." If you can keep it. Now, the conservative wants to keep it in America, at least up to this point. He wants to keep it. The progressive doesn't. That's the bottom line. He just doesn't. He wants socialism as an economic theory, and he doesn't want democracy in the constitutional Republican sense. He doesn't. Talk to anybody about talk to any progressive about the Constitution and about them using the courts to change the Constitution, and they'll all say the same thing. You can't change the Constitution fast enough to keep up with the times, so we have to use the courts to do that. And that's what they call a living Constitution. But that is exactly the thing that our founders didn't want to have happen. That's why they put a very strict limit or ability to change. You can change the Constitution, but you have to go through a lot of hoops to do it. And they did that for a reason, because they knew that if some moron president got in power, or some radical Congress, or a judiciary that went out of control, they understood, even before Marbury versus Madison, they understood that if these things happened, you could lose your republic, madam. And so, if you're listening to this, I would really hope that you would start calling yourself a classical liberal. Start understanding what these things mean. You should never, ever be a progressive. A progressive is just another word for a moron who doesn't understand the center will not hold, and who wants change in the government to make up for the fact that they're miserable in their own lives. And a conservative, well, he makes a different kind of mistake. And often he's a good person who's happy and just wants things to stay the same, likes his little town, likes his little job, and his little wife, and his little kids, and his little dog. And he thinks this is good. This is the good life. All right? But there are times when you look over to across the tracks and you see a black kid can't get the job he wants to get. So sometimes things have to change a little bit, make things a little better. And that's the way we should always look at change. A little better, not a lot better. You're not going to get a lot better, because then the law of unintended consequences come in. Every time politicians sell you on something, whether it be homeland security or economic programs that are massive, you should really look at that with a jaundiced eye, because those people are selling you snake oil. The best changes come incrementally and in small changes, almost always. If they're big changes, you might solve a small problem with a big change and have massive repercussions for that are negative across the board. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about this idea that there are three ways of thinking. One is the progressive, one is the conservative, and one is the classical liberal. And the progressives and the conservatives, they fight each other, but in some ways they're one and the same. They're just different parts of the cycle. The progressive fights for the change until they get the change that they want, and then they become conservatives. Conservatives fight against the change that they want, and then for all intents and purposes, they become the progressive, who accepts whatever change becomes the norm. And only the classical liberal sits there and says, whoa, why is that wall there? Maybe we should remove it, but maybe we shouldn't. And let's use our brains to choose wisely. Anyway, this is Jim Valvis talking about these things. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share this talk. It means a lot to me. It always means a lot to me. And, lots of stuff. So, especially subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell button so that you get notices for when I put up new videos. I'm not going to be putting them as much recently. I'm going to buy a couple of cameras. I'm going to start a new channel, actually a couple of new channels. One of them may be a commentary. I may separate my literary stuff from commentary. Anyway, so things going on, and I'm pretty busy. But I'm going to start the other stuff as well. The startup back with the poetry features. I'm looking forward to that. And anyway, again, thank you for listening. And as always, especially, God bless you.